You just finished draft number 6 of Spacers The Petrichor Conspiracy. What are your current thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, where to begin? This is really a story. Petrichor as a story goes back about as far as any other story in the Spacers Saga, because, and funnily enough, not just in terms of chronology within the lore, in terms of like when it's set, but also when it was written. Because if I remember correctly, Petrichor I started writing in like the spring of 2018. It was like basically I finished writing Shadow Play, which became the Erebus Effect, out now. Um, and then I started writing Shadow Play, or then I started writing Petrichor, which is now the Petrichor Conspiracy, and I might have even been writing them concurrently for a little bit because that's just how I roll. But it was one of those little serendipitous things. I saw a picture one day on, I think, Tumblr or something, back when Tumblr was still had decent art or whatever occasionally. I mean, it still kind of does, but there's plenty of also other stupid stuff too that you kind of wade through. But
Sure.
there was like a picture that I saw that just sort of jumped out at me like a flash bulb. That was a piece of art someone had done of like this of a UFO on the back of an armed flatbed trailer, like in front of some like in front of a hangar in like 1962, and like there's like soldiers standing milling about, and like CIA guys examining the flying saucer, and it's like, oh, that seems like something I might want to be involved in, is in terms of like telling that kind of story. Because I mean, the why do you it's basically it's the reason why the X-Files was so popular for so long, because it's taking the sort of stuff that we get up to in the Spacer Saga and making it relatable to people nowadays. Because as much as the stuff in the Spacer Saga is relatable, because it's, morality plays about stuff that we deal with in our own lives, politics and war and, struggles for resources and wealth and all this other stuff. It's not part of our own time. Whereas, especially the earlier drafts of Petrichor were set basically in our time. I mean, they were alternate history. It's always been alternate history, um, to some extent or another. But
What I like about Petrichor is we kind of show the divergence in the timeline. We
yes,
say
exactly.
this is where it changes because there's an asteroid that hits Phoenix. And so this
Mm-hmm.
is what's known as the Phoenix event.
That's
And the
correct.
material from that asteroid is spread all over the world and is used as a resource to generate cheap power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
And
kind of like a MacGuffin item. It's kind of like unobtainium from Avatar,
yes,
in that material that is like stored in this asteroid as it's like dusted, like sprinkled all over the world from the explosion of this huge asteroid. Maybe not huge, but sizable asteroid hitting Phoenix in 2013. It leaves behind stuff that, hey, we found a sizable enough piece that we can use it to like fuel our reactors and keep the power and the lights on. That was actually a brilliant addition that you came up with, in terms of having the reason behind the conspiracy in the Petrichor Conspiracy. That's literally what the Petrichor Conspiracy is. Earlier drafts of the story, going back to, I think, like the earliest that I did, the only thing about the Phoenix event was that it was this mysterious blast of unknown origin that leveled part of downtown Phoenix. And of course, it was at various points in the drafting of the story. It was set at different times. At one point, it was set in 1997 and was tied to the Phoenix Lights, which you may have heard of, which happened, I think, like in April of 1997, when a bunch of people in Arizona saw weird lights in the sky. So it was blamed on aliens. In other drafts of the story, it was set even earlier, and the story itself was like set in the 90s, kind of like an alternate 90s. But there was always that thread there, and I think the unifying power that you gave to it, in terms of having this be literally the source of the conspiracy. There's like this secretive organization that's gathering up the pieces of debris left over from this asteroid, and they're pulling the wool over the world's eyes, because the people who are involved in this, have a hand in what happened. We don't want to give it away, but there's some shady dealings going on.
Well, most
And it's
conspiracies involve people wanting to get more resources for themselves. It's about power, right?
yeah.
And I'm like, oh, well, most like the asteroid for me was this big inciting incident. And so
Mhm.
I'm like, oh, we'll have that be the inciting incident for the whole novel. And now we're on draft. You just finished draft number 6,
Mhm.
which I'm pretty excited about because draft number 6, I think, is where we really found the ending. We're going to develop things more. I mean, I think this thing has 2 more drafts left in it. Excuse me, because I'm going to do draft 7, and you're going to wrap it up with draft number 8.
Okay.
And so we found the ending, right? And and now that the ending has been found, I'm really excited to get in there and just do character work, right? Like, oh,
Yep.
like just find little places to develop people's characters. And one of the fun things about being your co-writer is I don't have to have final say in any of it, right? I could just go in there and play with some toys, and then you can either be like, that's good or that's not good or whatever, right? And I'm like, oh, I can just, and if he doesn't accept it, that's fine, you know. But it
You don't have
it
to make the toys, you just get to play with them, basically.
yeah, I'm not burdened with the responsibility of the final draft, which honestly, in our writing
It's kind of like
partnership, I really enjoy.
getting to play with presents from Santa Claus. You didn't have to actually make the presents, or pay for the presents. You just
Yeah,
play with them.
I can just play with some toys.
Yeah.
And so as a writer, that's a lot of fun. I'm enjoying the rewrite aspect of it. I think at the end of draft 6, we have it set up for the sequel because I mean, we'll sequelize anything, especially if someone buys it the first time.
Exactly.
And
And this is honestly set up for sequels because basically, again, going back to the meat and potatoes of what the Petrichor Conspiracy story is, this is the origin point. This is the origin story for the Spacers Saga. Obviously not just in terms of like where the divergence point is in the timeline, it's where all of the lore gets going,
yeah,
because the events of the Petrichor Conspiracy and any books that would follow on in that saga, that series, whatever you want to call it, that serial, are the story of how the ICA came to be, how the Spacers Corps came to be. In fact, if anything, there's our ending for the series. Like they've established the ICA and they're trying to get it off the ground, and the end the series ends with Teresa Coruscant like joining the Spacer Corps as like its first officer or something.
I I see this as the first book in the Spacer Saga, and
Yeah.
Erebus is probably something like book 27, even though Erebus came out first. That was just the one we finished.
It's
But
kind of like how Iron Man came out, to go to touch on an analogy we've been using this week. It's kind of like how Iron Man came out first, but Captain America is set earlier, much
yeah,
earlier,
you
obviously.
did such a good job developing this over 2 decades, right? The whole general like 30,000 foot view, you've got the whole universe mapped out in your head. Um, yeah, no, I see it as like one, like if we had like if we're gonna write 100 books in the Spacer Saga, we've written book 1, book 26, book 27, and we've got part of book 35, which will be the Titan Gambit, which probably at the rate we're
Yeah,
going 2025, 2026.
yeah,
um Actually no, because
which is fun. It means we'll have plenty of stuff to cover for a long time.
a long time, but I don't know if it'll be 2026 because at the time of recording, it's January 24, and we're almost done with Petrichor, and Europa is doing good, right? Like
Yeah.
we're still working on that. And so I feel like Titan we'll probably start work in earnest on Titan sometime in 2024. And what's fun about these podcast episodes is it's just like background stuff. It's how to write a thing, you know. And something I like about I've never really written a conspiracy thing before. Well, that's not true. Before I started working in earnest on the Spacers Saga, I've never really written a conspiracy. Now we're on the third one. So if you like science fiction conspiracies with emotionally broken law enforcement officers, you'll love the Spacers Saga. Boy, howdy. And, um,
Well,
but no,
that's why I need to keep people to make people stick around until I get to the Titan Gambit, because the Titan Gambit is arguably very different. It's basically more of a spacer style. That's our first book that we released a couple years ago as sort of a test run.
yeah.
It's more of a spacer style war story, because it basically, I know this is a Petrichor episode, but why not? Why not cross pollinate? The Titan Gambit is basically the story of three best friends from Mars who go off to war, and then their adventures and misadventures during that war.
Yeah.
And
And
obviously it's meant to be a series as well, because the Titan Gambit is the first book in probably like 5, 6, or 7 that I have planned in that series, because the war lasts like 8 years, is like 8 years long. So plenty of stories to tell there.
we'll get to all of them, I promise. Um, you know,
It'll be like if the Dominion War lasted 8 years instead of 2. They would have
well,
had
you
an
know, like it's the Asimov wrote his robot series and then the Foundation series, and they both kind of met in the middle. Now, what
yeah.
we're doing is designed to like all make sense in a giant like expanded universe. Um, but what I'm liking about adding into the conspiracy itself. Like my last draft, I was looking for places that kind of be like, oh, well, this is a bad guy. And this bad guy does this bad thing, right? Like, for instance, I was because at one point, okay, so to kind of broad stroke brush this, you've got the status quo people, which are our heroes, right? Our heroes are essentially status quo people who are betrayed by the status quo and then have to go join the counter movement, right? And uh, uh, the counter movement is ran by a guy named Vernon Morrow, who is this big sort of like larger than life V for Vendetta sort of guy who has it in for the status quo. And I kept trying to think, okay, status quo people don't join insurgencies off the drop of the hat, right? They don't do that just because it's like a Tuesday. The status quo has to fundamentally reject them. They have to be so like, oh, this isn't working anymore to do that. And early on in draft 5, we had Tom Morrow and Alicia. They're our two main heroes. They are and Tom Morrow. What's the organization called again?
The the one that Tom's part of,
Yeah,
the Bureau of Special Investigations.
right. They're in the Bureau of Special Investigations place, and then the Bureau sends Tom and Alicia off to the West Coast to link up with the Major Coruscant. Is that how you say her name?
Yep. Yep.
Major
That's
Coruscant, and they're going to go investigate the disappearance of Dr. Fujitsu, who we like to call Dr. What's his name because I have trouble pronouncing, Japanese apparently. And in draft 4, they just kind of did that. And then they're like, hey, I guess we'll go meet up with V from Vendetta and then go like work for him. And there's not really an inciting incident that gets us from status quo to against the status quo. And I thought if the status quo was going to betray them, if there's bad guys working within the status quo, those and you've got our heroes that are investigating this great big mystery, the status quo bad guys will send our heroes into a trap, and then they get trapped, and then they get chased, and then they realize, oh, the status quo has betrayed us. That was a fun little bit. I'm trying to talk about it without talking about it too much. But that was a fun little bit we had in there. And I thought, oh, that could be kind of. I've never really had that much fun writing conspiracies before this, or like I so enjoy writing bits of this conspiracy. And then, of course, the anti-status quo agent, as they're working with him, as he's working through them, they realize, oh, he kind of sucks too. and and
Everyone has their own agenda. There's everyone has an agenda
yes,
in this story. That's one of the big things about it. Everyone thinks their agenda is the right one, and that's not necessarily true. That's real life. There's a character that we have in some of the earlier drafts that got cut out of the later drafts of this story that will probably make it into future stories in this series or whatever, who is like the leader of the bad guy, the leader of Project Petrichor. And he is basically a representation of the pitfalls of the status quo. That, even though the status quo arguably keeps people fed and housed and keeps the lights on and keeps the heat on and keeps or whatever, it comes with a cost, because sometimes you have to grind up people and turn them to sausage in order to feed feed the pigs, so to speak.
exactly. I think my biggest question now, right? I haven't read all of draft 6 yet. I've only checked out the end just to kind of see the what you built onto what I put there. And I'm so excited for the ending. And I love how with the ending, we took the $50 million Michael Bay Act 3 and turned it into a $5 million Kevin Smith Red State shootout. And it's so tight and it's so to the point, and it's something I'm excited to explore is the post-traumatic stress disorder of our hero Tom Morrow, who spent his formative years fighting in the deserts of Iran, and how he you know without giving too much away, there's a shootout scene, and something I'm really proud of. Right now, speaking as a veteran, I've never once had someone shoot at me with the intention to kill me. Right, I've been kind of nearest where guns were fired before, but you know what I mean. No one's been like, I'm going to kill him now. That's never happened. But I imagine if I was in a situation where I'm behind a wall and people are trying to murder me through a window, I would sob uncontrollably and shit my pants while I try to return fire. I feel like I would return fire, but I would shit my pants the whole time, because that shit sounds fucking terrifying, you know? And, and I think that is a natural reaction. I think that's because someone's trying to fucking kill you. And, you know, and yes, Tom's a grizzled veteran, but I also love the idea that he's not John Rambo. He's just a guy who managed to survive. Sometimes grizzled veterans are just dudes who didn't have a bullet with their name on it. You're still scared, right? Like I've told this story on this podcast a couple of times, but long story short, February 2020, I was driving a van, then the brakes went out, and I was on a major street, and I screamed uncontrollably for, we'll call it, a third of a mile, as I navigated my way through parked cars and oncoming ambulances, and then I found an empty lot to do donuts in down the street from my house, and I sobbed the whole time, nearly hyperventilating till I passed out. And now I spent a long time in the military. I know I'm useful in a crisis, and that was probably one of the scariest events of my entire life. Because you're driving down a busy street, you're in a big van. Oh no, there's no brakes. What do we do?
See,
And
I think the thing that you've touched on here is something that's really central to the story in ways that you probably don't realize. Because I don't know if this is stuck through in the more recent drafts or if you remember it from earlier drafts or whatever, but there's an event in Tom's life where he even went into the military that really is why he ended up going into the Bureau later on, where he was in this little, it's like a ghost town in southwestern Nevada called Rhyolite. And the reason I included Rhyolite is because, long story short, when I got my wisdom teeth out back in the like early spring or like late winter, like early part of 2018 or 2017, I was briefly very obsessed with ghost towns in the American Southwest because, I was taking pain medication and I was holed up at home for a few days. And I basically just sat around pictures of all these cool ghost towns and like in places like Nevada and California and Arizona and blah, blah, blah.
sure.
But the idea I had was that Tom and some of his his cousin, his older cousin, some of their friends were like exploring around Rhyolite, and like they basically had a UFO experience. And of course, there's a reason for there's an explanation for that we can see in the story that we won't give away now.
Yeah.
But that always affected him because it's like he had this close encounter experience that was actually kind of traumatic.
Yeah.
So he has trauma going back even further than almost being blown up by a truck bomb in Tabriz, Iran.
Yeah.
And going through like convoy ambushes and stuff like that in Iran, stuff like and that builds upon that trauma. So, and then of course there's the other characters. You have Teresa, the major, as you called her, who's she. I don't know. I think we might have discussed this in via text at the very least, but she's from Iran.
Yeah.
She was born in Iran before the alternate history version of the riots and protests that happened back in like 2023 last year. That is, in the Spacers Saga version of history, those escalated into like a full scale like uprising. And because the like Iraq and Afghanistan wars had been cut short by the fact that the Phoenix event happened in 2013, those events had happened differently maybe. Iran ended up becoming like a full scale, what would you call it? Intervention and occupation.
We went to Iran instead of Iraq.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Basically, yeah. Just the way history happened slightly differently, slightly different dominoes fell in this universe. But that's not the important part. The important part is that because Teresa was born in Iran and lived there until she was like 11 or so, I want to say, she had a firsthand experience. She had firsthand experience with the sort of rough with when things went crazy in the country in this alternate version of 2023. And then she and her family, at least the ones who managed to get out, immigrated to the United States. She went to the Air Force Academy and flew like I envision her as having flown an A-10 or something like that, basically flying like close air support for ground forces. It's like I can't remember if we've kept this exchange in the current draft, but there's an exchange where like the major mentions that she flew strike, like she's explaining what she did to Isha, who's the outsider of the group because she was never in the military and has no military experience. She says, "Oh, I flew strike fighters during the war and in support of the ground pounders." And Tom's like, "We thank you for it." Something like that.
It's something I like to touch on about Alicia too. Alicia is the scientist who feels very out of place around all the military veterans, and there's aspects of her character I honestly don't like. Now that's a good thing. That's a good thing because
It shows that she's doing her job as a character. She's making you feel things.
Exactly.
And it's not necessarily that she's unlikable, it's that she's trying too hard to prove herself to the people who you identify with as a veteran, a former military member.
exactly like if I'm hanging out with two veterans and this lady, and then she's like, "Oh, you guys don't like me because I'm not a veteran." I'd be like, "What in the fuck are you talking? Like what? Like no, you're not here because you're one of us. You're here because you bring this whole unique thing to the table, and you
Exactly.
probably don't have this overwhelming sense of melancholy about you like we do."
And see
And
that again, there's room to grow there because there's again, we've talked about how Petrichor is meant to be a multi-book series,
oh yeah,
or the Petrichor, or whatever we end up calling the series that it's a part of, the Petrichor Conspiracy. Alicia would grow as a character. She eventually becomes more sure of herself, especially around these people that she comes to trust, because they become a team. I mean, I'm surprised I haven't mentioned this until this far into the episode, but the number one inspiration for Petrichor, before even that picture that I mentioned, is Stargate SG-1.
yeah.
It's the idea that you have this eclectic team with like a couple of scientists, one of whom is in the military. Of course, in the case of Petrichor, neither of them are. But you got basically 4 people from all different backgrounds, and they come together to solve this particular problem and do this particular mission. And as I think I might have explained, I might have mentioned this to you a few weeks ago. Basically, the inspiration for the Petrichor story are the on Earth episodes of Stargate SG-1, where they're dealing with like all of the like political intrigue and social commentary of stuff like Harry Mayborn and Senator Kinsey and all these people trying to manipulate the Stargate program for their own ends. There's a brilliant, again, I want to say Tumblr post that I saw once, or someone pointed out that all of the off-world episodes of Stargate SG-1 are all invariably sort of like, hey, we've got so much potential. Let's go explore the galaxy and fight alien bad guys and find cool technology. Whereas all of the on-Earth episodes of Stargate SG-1 are like, the government is corrupt. The people in power are trying to control the Stargate for their own wealth and power and blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of true.
Yeah. And that's exactly what it would be. That would 1,000% happen.
Yeah.
And and going back to Alicia a little bit, I found myself, I kept wanting to restructure her character to make her more confident, to make her less insecure about her veteran or her lack of veteran status, as I think the VA would put it, and to just kind of have that not be a thing. But then I'm like, oh, that insecurity defines her as a character. So
Yeah.
it's essential to who she is, because otherwise she's just like Tom, but with a science degree.
Yeah.
So,
That's the
oh,
thing
we,
is,
we need
it's
to
I think
keep.
we've talked about this in the past.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. We've talked about this in the past too, how you don't traditionally draw, I almost said draw. You don't traditionally produce insecure characters because it's not in your nature.
Yeah.
I am more insecure, so I traditionally have produced a lot of insecure characters, or characters with varying degrees of insecurity. It's
Yeah.
kind of a write what you know type situation. And Alicia is basically me if I had like a degree, like a doctoral degree in archaeology and anthropology or whatever, and was
Okay.
a woman.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Alicia comes down to. That's basically how I would describe her character.
Can I ask you this? We can cut this out if this is too personal. Do you ever feel out of place around me and my veteran friends?
No, but that's only because I traditionally have been around people that I'm out of place with so long. I think the difference is that Alicia may not be autistic, or at least not
Yeah.
as autistic as me. The thing is, I've been around people that I didn't necessarily fit in with my whole life.
Hmm.
Like my dad, and we can keep this in if you want, because it's actually kind of a cool comment. But it's like, when I was a kid, and this is something that I've admitted for years. When I was a kid, most of my friends were my dad's friends, who were like decades older than me, and
Yeah.
I held my ground. I won't say held my ground because that sounds weird. Cut
You
that
kind
part.
of earned your seat at the table.
Yes, I earned my seat at the table. That's a good way to put it. I held
A conversation.
I held a conversation with people who are often years, ahead of me in terms of life experience and wisdom and so on. And and not just people that are older than me, but often people who have differing opinions and differing backgrounds. When I first went to college at Trine up in northern Indiana, I was around a lot of who were politically different than me, especially when I was in the ROTC program. And it's just something you kind of get used to. You kind of get used to associating with people who you probably wouldn't seek out as friends if you were just like a vanilla human, but because of circumstances, you come to appreciate them for their own merits. And when I'm hanging out with you and your veteran friends, I don't see myself as better because I just see myself as a member of the group who does not have the same background. There's a small but distinct difference there. If you see yourself as an outsider, you see the difference between yourself and the people around you as a weakness. But if you see yourself as someone who just shares a different background, you just see yourself as someone who shares a different background. It's a different circumstance, but it's not necessarily a crutch that you have to lean on.
And I think with that, we'll end there. For the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin.
I'm Nick.
And we will see you next Monday morning at 0700.